This is a picture, sort of a cartoonish kind of picture there, but of a war also in China, but a long time earlier. This is part of the Second Opium War. It was called the Arrow War. This is where the British are in China establishing more and more control over trade. And what they're trying to do essentially is control as much as possible, while other great powers in Europe are trying to control parts of China as well. So essentially, this is called the Arrow War. Essentially, there was an excuse to start a war in China, brought up over the confiscation of a ship. So there was a Chinese ship that had previously been a flagged British vessel. And the Chinese authorities had held this ship because it was believed that it was committing piracy in the waters. And so the Chinese authorities would fully within their rights said, we're holding this ship, and the British used the excuse, the fact that it had once been a flagged British vessel, to declare war on China and open up the Second Opium War to gain more and more control of the trade there in the major Chinese cities along the coast. All right, so I bring up these three different examples, two where aggressive acts happen, but we don't go to war, at least not yet, and a third where an act happens that doesn't really seem that aggressive, and war does happen. And the point I'm trying to make here is that threshold between competition, maybe, or conflict and open warfare is a moving target. It's not hard and fast, and it's not really clearly defined prior to the events themselves that trigger a war and prior to them happening. Essentially, you don't have open warfare until both sides agree that you're going to war. In the case of Germany, they can invade other countries with their military, but if nobody else is willing to fight over that, then even though that was an aggressive act that sort of counts every definition you can think of this is an act of war, if the other side doesn't agree it's an act of war and isn't willing to go to war over that, then it's no longer an act of war. So then what is it? That's where you started getting these gray zone, or this, there's a lot of other terms will show up here, but other aspects of competition, other terms and spaces where we're competing, but we're not actually in open warfare. So there's a couple different definitions to go through here. I'll run through some that are kind of my favorite. So this idea of somewhere between routine statecraft and open warfare. Actions competitive in nature, but often fall below the threshold of war, which again is defined by both parties in terms of when both sides agree that they're at war. Competitive interactions among and within state and non-state actors that fall between traditional war and peace duality. And then there's a bunch of other small little terms here popping up that you might have seen before that are generally used to define or describe this competition space. Irregular warfare, we've heard a lot about that. Active meshes, hybrid warfare, that's another one that's coming up a lot. Competition, strategic competition, these are all terms that are describing something other than sort of traditional open warfare, but certainly not diplomacy either. This is that first definition there, somewhere between routine statecraft and open warfare. Back up a second. There is no official definition here. Gray zone is used a lot, and you'll see some academics talking about how gray zone, that's just another name for what we have already been doing. I think a lot of people are fairly familiar with actions that states take against one another that aren't in open warfare. I'd like to point out that the Cold War was a 30+ year, gray zone war. It's not something that we're completely unfamiliar with. It's a bit of a new term, but certainly not a new concept. So if these are the names, then what are the actions? What things constitute gray zone warfare? So I'm going to show you some little news clips from the last couple of years, mostly China and Russia, but there's a little bit of Iran and North Korea because they're doing this stuff too, the gray zone stuff, even though we don't consider them great powers. We see from some of these headlines. I mean, we're talking about intellectual property theft, space actions, Huawei stuff, which has obviously changed a bit in the last year or so. Actions taken in other parts of the world that are part of competition, not warfare in the traditional sense, but this is certainly something where China is going after their strategic aims, and oftentimes at our loss. And some more examples here. So Africa's a great place to study gray zone warfare because a lot of it's happening there. It's we don't think of Africa often when we talk great power competition because there are no great powers that we interact with, at least. Not great powers by most definitions on Africa itself, but it is a space where the great powers are competing. So this is where China is making investments. This probably needs to be updated, but this is since 2010 to probably about 2018, and it's certainly continuing. Another slide more or less showing similar type data here in terms of where they're at. The orange countries there. So Burkina Faso, Central African Republic. Those are at the time, not true anymore, but at the time, this was the only countries where China wasn't engaging. And in the case of Central African Republic, the Russians are there. Digital Silk Road, again, expanding through Africa. Again, I'm just using Africa as an example of here where this is spreading, and you guys are probably quite familiar with a lot of this, certainly elsewhere in the world too, where the Digital Silk Road or the Belt and Road Project are spreading through. But this is an example of the places where actions are happening in competition, to this great power competition. You're all quite familiar with this, I'm sure, the island building in the South China Sea and the sort of conflicts that vary in different degrees and different participants in the region. Hey, correct me if I'm wrong. I think you guys plug in one of your scenarios working on South China Sea thing, right? I think you do. It's scenarios you're going to see a lot. I know from ACSC's perspective, we've done a lot of South China Sea China scenarios specifically because of the competition that's happening here. So here's an example of Gavin Reef and the Spratlys. Again, you guys are probably familiar with this, but if not, here's an example of what we talk about with island building and just sort of action in the gray zone. So in the matter of a little more than a year, you have an installation that allows China to project power in some form or fashion. This is kind of a small one, but here's one you probably are pretty familiar with. When we say island building, they're literally building islands off of shoals and reefs and things like that, dredging sand and piling stuff up. This is Fiery Cross. They're in South China Sea. So again, about 3 years old, but that is a full up air base right there. And you guys can understand the challenge that presents us and our allies operating in that AOR if China is building air bases kind of wherever they want there in the South China Sea. Again, this is some of that gray zone competition. Not open warfare for sure, but certainly something that's more than just traditional action, particularly when you have a variety of nations claiming authority or sort of control of these areas in the South China Sea. These little islands, the ones that actually exist, are oftentimes claimed by several different countries. And then if you guys are familiar with China's 9-dash line, I mean, they basically are staking out a huge chunk of the South China Sea for their own claims, mineral rights, fishing, things like that, that are definitely, in terms of the international law, far beyond what they can actually claim. And stuff like this, along with aggressive actions in terms of keeping people out of these regions, are part of this gray zone competition. There's a little map there, give you an idea of where these places are. You can see the 9-dash line there, stretching like past Vietnam into near Malaysia and all that, far beyond the traditional allowed sort of claims and ocean claims. Belt and Road, I mentioned that. You guys are pretty familiar with it. I'm sure buying up a lot of ports all across Europe, along with establishing ports throughout the Pacific and the Indian Ocean. Another example here of the different places and things that are being invested for this Belt and Road on the digital side of things. So it's not just China, Russia's involved as well. Sort of the perfect example of a version of gray zone here is obviously the invasion of Crimea, the occupation and control of Crimea. Little green men, obviously soldiers, obviously equipped with Russian equipment, and gosh, I don't know who else would be interested in this area, but no patches, and so Russia's able to more or less claim, oh, it's not our guys. And again, then the ball's back in the court, in this case, of the West and the U.S., and we can say all we want, but if we're not going to go in there and fight them, then this isn't war. This is just competition of some phase or form. Gray zone warfare, and as it stands today, Crimea is still controlled by Russia, and despite our stern reaction in terms of sanctions and diplomatic efforts, Russia's still there, and I would argue that they have achieved their national aims. Their strategy worked. They got what they wanted out of it. Now, obviously, economic pressure means a lot, but doesn't mean enough in this case. And even though a sovereign nation was invaded by a military force with those little green men, there was no war. Obviously, Ukraine is at war with separatists in the Donbass region there, but they aren't fighting with Russia. There's enough sort of room for not room for error, but sort of the, you know, the gray zone, the ambiguity that Ukraine isn't really willing to go to war with Russia by themselves, and we certainly aren't willing to, apparently, to go to war over something like Crimea. So Russia operates in this gray zone. They push the boundary in terms of how far we were able to get away with something, and that space is allowed to them, and so they occupy it. I mentioned earlier, Central African Republic, as you guys are probably familiar, Russian mercenaries are operating in part of Africa, but also in the Middle East. Syria is a good example of that. Here's a couple more articles talking about the type of things that Russia's doing that can be defined as gray zone actions. Obviously, social media information operations were pretty big with the 2020 election, and again with the 2016 election as well. These are the types of things that there's a lot of space there for adversaries to operate in, and a lot of ambiguity as well. When it comes to cyber warfare and information ops and things like that, it's very difficult to, at times, to pin down who exactly is responsible, and so it leaves a lot of space for state actors that aren't willing to play by the rules, that are willing to obfuscate who's behind the actual, you know, hackers or the people involved in disrupting elections and things like that, are happy to sort of play in the shadows there. And while, you know, it may be obvious to everybody else who's behind it all, it's difficult for a different state, you know, that is going to follow international law to pin them down over this. All right, so here's some examples of Iran in the gray zone. Again, we're focusing a bit more on great power competition here, but just to point out, it's not just great powers that do this. It's basically everybody that doesn't want to fight America head to head. So North Korea, leaning a lot on cyber in their case. Okay, so is this new? What's changed about war where we're having this you know, new terms like gray zone warfare coming up, and a lot of focus and intention given to things that are pretty non-traditional when it comes to warfare? We're talking cyber warfare, we're talking island building, things like that. So I would argue that technology has opened up a lot of competition space. It's now easier for great powers to compete with one another outside the threshold of war because of what technology affords us. And the space between peace and war has never been empty, but I think we like to think of it as Americans, at least, as an empty space because we're very familiar with you know, wars in the 20th century that were pretty clearly defined and clear cut, at least. You know, the war starts. You know, we're attacked at Pearl Harbor. We land at, you know, Normandy on D-Day. You know, some very concrete things of warfare. We beat the bad guys. You know, it's very black and white who the bad guy is and who the good guys are. And then, well, you know, we're the occupiers, and this is sort of how war goes, at least in a lot of our popular memory. World War I was somewhat similar in the sense that there was an invasion, alliances were formed and brought together, and we went and fought, and then somebody lost, and you have peace treaties, you know, and that's that. And things kind of go back to the normal state. If you have a minute afterwards, you know, look up the Peace of Westphalia. 1648 is kind of where we get a lot of those foundations of what warfare is supposed to be and how states are supposed to interact. You may have heard like Westphalian states. Basically, it means that what was decided there was that states are the ones who can create war, who can start a war and fight a war, and it's states who decide how wars go, and it's states who decide how wars end. And typically, it ends with some sort of treaty. Somebody loses some territory, somebody has to pay reparations, and all that. And it's sort of seen as it's a codified way of states interacting, trying to provide some order to warfare. Now, as you can probably imagine, that's not how all war works, and certainly not how it's all worked in all over the world. It may have been that way in Europe for several centuries, but it's not really how war operated in a lot of other places. Tons of other examples in the 20th century of really ambiguous wars. Was this really a war? What if we didn't declare a war, but we're fighting anyway? You think of Korea, you think of Vietnam, and a lot of other actions. The United Nations actions. I mean, some of these are police actions, not war. So it gets kind of complicated here. The point I'm trying to make is that it's not necessarily new that we're sitting here in 2021 saying, oh, you know, gray zone warfare and these actions the states are taking against America. I mean, it's a thing that's been around for quite a while. It's a bit different now. This is where you get sort of that discussion about the character of war versus the nature of war. The character will change over time. This comes from Clausewitz, but the nature of war will always stay the same in the sense that war in itself has some enduring principles about having adversaries and involving violence and things like that. So gray zone, which can certainly involve violence, is also war, but it's just a little bit different character than what we're primarily familiar with. So Liddell Hart, Sun Tzu, George Kennan, they all talk about basically what we today define as gray zone warfare. So Liddell Hart, they're saying, true aim is not so much to seek a battle as to seek a strategic situation so advantageous that if it does not itself produce the decision, it is a continuation by a battle that is sure to achieve this. And so this continual effort to gain strategic advantage over the adversary. George Kennan, he's the guy that wrote the long telegram that that more or less established containment in the Cold War, a principle of containing the Soviet Union that comes from George Kennan. Employment all means at the nation's command short of war to achieve its national objectives. And this is something that has been around for a while. And of course, Sun Tzu, best victory is when the opponent surrenders on his own accord before there are any actual hostilities, to win without fighting. And that's, again, this is not a new concept in itself, but it's changed a bit with technology. Cyber warfare, social media, the amount of reliance we have on space and the electromagnetic spectrum, these are all expansions of competition. Increased globalization of economy ties us all together even more and makes things that happen in places like the South China Sea matter to countries that are quite a long ways away from the South China Sea. Also, our adversaries have learned to avoid open warfare. We spent about 20 years now demonstrating that we're really good at fighting. And at the tactical level, we are incredibly proficient. We can bring a lot of force to bear, and we have the advantage in just about every respect tactically. And this quote here has been attributed to McMaster. 2 ways to fight the United States. You either fight us asymmetrically or you fight us stupid. And so, I mean, if you want to go head to head, it's not going to be great. Now, there aren't a lot of powers that could really challenge us on equal footing. China's the closest, but even there, China, on equal footing and sort of a neutral space, if you will, you're going to have a heck of a time. Now, fighting in their backyard is going to be a really hard fight for us. I mean, the A2AD capabilities and things like that make it very, very, very difficult. But if this was sort of on an equal playing ground, it's a different story entirely. So this asymmetric option of competing with the U.S., of fighting the U.S., is pretty attractive to a lot of people. And one of the reasons is because we're not even engaged in this competition space. Gray zone warfare and sort of all these asymmetric operations, it's not really something that we see as DoD as a common way or even a normal way of fighting. We expect to deploy, we expect to be in somewhat conventional operations in the sense that we're doing what the military does, our traditional operations. So, flying sorties, going on patrol, sailing through this wherever, and that's the type of stuff we normally do. These things are a bit different, and it's difficult for us to wrap our heads around it. So you have a couple of things that we can do. You guys are probably familiar with NDS and NSS in terms of how it frames this competition. So they all point to the fact that our policy documents here point to the fact that we need to coordinate these instruments of national power. And right there from JP3 is the definition of strategy as the DoD sees it, right? So it would be useful at some point if you guys get fairly familiar with this. And now, right now in your career, probably not dealing with this too much, but in a few years, you might be starting to engage in areas where strategy is discussed and worked on and employed in your next couple jobs. So this might be something to wrap your heads around here, but prudent idea or set of ideas for the employment of the instruments of national power in a synchronized and integrated fashion to achieve theater, national, or multinational objectives. So the key point here that I want to point out that this is the employment of the instruments of national power. That's more than just the military. There's a lot of national instruments of power that our nation has between diplomacy, economics, information, things like that. Think about DIME. But the military is a big part, but not the only part. So from the NSS, I'm not going to read this whole thing, but I bolded a few lines here that I think help illustrate our position here with the great power competition. So they operate in this sort of gray space at the edge of international law. And I like this point here that they're unencumbered by truth. So they're not good faith actors because they don't have to be. One of the challenges with being the superpower, the hyperpower, is the fact that we're the ones holding everybody else to the rules. We're the big guy on the blocks that requires us to, if we want the world to have sort of rules-based approach to things, then we're the ones who need to embody it and enforce it, which means we're encumbered by the truth. Our adversaries are unencumbered. They don't have to follow the rules, and they know it. Again, from the NSS, this problem of the fact that we see the world in binary terms of at peace or at war, when it's really this continuous competition. Again, not a new thing necessarily, but something we probably need to reframe ourselves after the Cold War. I mentioned the dime earlier. Those are broadly the instruments of power here. So diplomatic, intelligence, military, and economic. I've also heard the I to be information. This is calling for an upgrade to our political and economic instruments to operate across these environments in the full spectrum of conflict. One of the problems the U.S. has is the fact that if it can't be dealt with sort of in a very cordial diplomatic fashion, we use the military. The military has been the easy button for a long, long time. And so a lot of our strategy and our options are seen as primarily only military options, which ties our hands in a lot of ways. Because something might happen, for example, in the South China Sea, and the instinct is maybe, all right, let's use the military to deal with this problem. This is a military answer to this. And you have a hard time selling that to a population that may not even be familiar with where the South China Sea is or why we need to go put 2 carriers on the bottom of it to do something against China. I mean, do we really care about something in South China Sea? South China Sea, I can say that. I think there's an argument you could probably make for, yeah, we probably do need some actions taken there. Not necessarily military. It could get to that point, perhaps, depending on how you define our national interests. But it's not it's probably not a problem that has to be addressed with the military, and that's something we need to be a bit more familiar with. Now, when it comes to what the military can do, there's some options here that are beyond our traditional operations. There's a number of things the military can do that don't necessarily involve kinetic operations. And last, from the NDS here, talking about the need for sort of this broad understanding of strategy and the employment of our instruments of power, competing against across all dimensions of power. You know, if you guys haven't heard the term revisionist, they're on the first line. Revisionist power, China and Russia are great examples of this. They are powers that are trying to change the status quo. They want to change the way the world is structured in terms of power relationships to better their position. Totally understandable. If you follow the realist school of international relations, revisionist powers are a thing that are going to exist as long as there is a structure of power where somebody's more powerful than somebody else. Right. So what's the military's role here? So I pointed out that military is often seen as the easy button, and we don't necessarily want it like that because the U.S. has a lot of instruments of power at its disposal, and a good strategy should involve a lot more than just the military or just one element. So where does the guidance come from? I think you guys might be diving into a little bit of this once you get into through your curriculum here, but the JSCAP, the Joint Strategic Capabilities Plan, this provides the strategic, and I'm reading it here, the operational guidance from the Chairman Joint Chief to the combatant commanders and the service chiefs, and then it breaks down a little bit more into provides the what for the guidance for the employment of the force. This is where strategy comes from, for how, but at the end of the day, you operators are employing what a strategy that was developed from the policies brought all the way down through the JSCAP, through the GEF, and then even further into combatant command plans and things like that. So what are some of the things that the military can do? Well, probably heard of foreign internal defense. This is something where it's not traditional military operation. Some units do it a lot more than others. Green Berets do a lot of this. This is exactly the kind of thing that exists in the gray zone. It's not warfare, but it's not traditional diplomacy either. We're not somewhere in Scotland helping them build up their military, because that's not something you would do to an ally. But we may be somewhere in maybe in Indo-PACOM working with, in fact, we absolutely are working with partners there so they can better defend themselves and prevent sort of more of a problem set for China to deal with. A lot of soft stuff falls in gray zone warfare. Cyber operations are a huge space right now for gray zone warfare. Attribution problem is one of the reasons why it's really easy for nefarious actors to cause problems for states, but it can be hard for us to determine who did it and then provide some retribution. Interestingly, with the Colonial Pipeline hack, they were able to get a good chunk of the money back, apparently. And as you guys probably saw in the recent summit that Biden had with Putin, this was one of the things that was brought up where Biden is specifically discussing cyber hacks on our critical infrastructure, things like oil pipelines. And of course, Russia is easily able to say, oh, no, that wasn't us, it was some nefarious group, whatever. And until we're willing to sort of hold a state actor hold their feet to the fire for the actions of somebody that's operating in their countries, they're going to continue to use that excuse. Information warfare is huge, a major part of this. Extremely complicated and complex, but also a really rich space for us to operate in, because I guarantee you, our adversaries are there. Strategic messaging is key. There's a lot of things that we can do that can be incredibly powerful as a military. Like bomber task force is a commonly used one, but there's a lot of other things that, when tied to a strategic message, can be really, really powerful. This doesn't require kinetic actions. It doesn't require killing people, putting bombs on foreheads or anything like that. This can simply be an action taken in an area that is, on the face of it or by itself, pretty innocent. But when tied to a strategic message and communicated properly, can send a pretty powerful shockwave to an adversary of messaging our intent, or sort of providing support for an ally or a partner. Okay. Transition real quick. So one of the ways that gray zone warfare ties into great power competition is through a mechanism called globally integrated operations. So if we recognize that great powers are competing across the globe, then we need to have our operations also integrated across the globe. And so Chairman Dunford had come up with this: global plans instead of regional plans. In the point here in that second bullet there, when you have our peer and near peer adversaries, and so I definitely consider Russia a near peer, and China's the only one that's even anywhere close to being called a peer adversary. But a fight with them, any part of the world where they're plugging in, is going to be a fight everywhere. They have interests, they have capabilities all over the globe, particularly China. And so if we're going to have any conflict with them, we need to recognize that it's going to be a global conflict. It will not just be in the South China Sea. In fact, if we see a conflict with China over something of the South China Sea as being only restricted to the South China Sea, then we are already losing, because China is definitely going to leverage their capability and their effects from everywhere in the globe where they're plugged in. So you're probably familiar with this. This is a little out of date in terms of how the world's broken up into combatant commands. This actually came from a globally integrated operations slide deck to try to show how that works. So you've got the traditional combatant commands, and you have your functional commands. Obviously, Spacecom's not quite plugged in, Spacecom, but the Space Force isn't quite plugged into exactly how this is going to work yet. This slide, I think, predates the Space Force by a little bit, but trying to demonstrate basically that the global combat commands are going to work with one another undoubtedly, but also the functionals are going to be relied on heavily. I mean, talk about everything that's going to be required from SOF, from Global Strike, from obviously Cybercom. This is some significant effort to bring everything together. Here's an example of that. This was a student product that was done a couple years ago in JADS, but trying to demonstrate what a fight with China might look like across the globe in terms of the different places where we might be engaged with them and the different priorities of effort depending on what's going on. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this, but I just want to sort of demonstrate to you what this might look like if you tried, an actual globally integrated operation. And this is still very generalistic and simplistic, just because you'd be overwhelmed with the data to try to fully demonstrate what this might look like. All right, so Joint Doctrine Note came out to try to dive into this competition idea here. Specifically, this idea of a continuum of competition, being that you have all the way at the bottom end, if you will, to the left side of competition, where it's no longer routine statecraft, but just barely not. All the way to the right, which would be open warfare, is the next line there. So that space in between is this continuum of normally getting along with our allies and partners to open warfare with somebody else. And the idea here is that competition isn't a switch that's flipped on or off. It just sort of goes through sort of varying shades and levels of intensity, which dictate different actions, but it's always ongoing. It is a constant effort because adversaries and then partners, everybody is trying to make sure that their state, their nation is at a continual strategic advantage, or is always trying to get that strategic advantage. Range of military operations. So I realized when I was reviewing my slides that I might be dating myself. Tony Romo's been out of the league for quite a while, but hopefully he still has an enduring legacy enough that you guys are familiar with that. So football joke there, range of military operations are pretty dang broad. Real quick on joint all-domain operations. So I've described this before, that JADO is the the how to the why of great power competition, and then vice versa. The why of JADO is great power competition. We have to do joint all domain operations because our great power competition is going to require us to operate across all domains across the globe. And we do that jointly because that's how we're organized. So JADO allows us to view conflict across this continuum of competition and of conflict there around the globe, but across the instruments of national power. It's more than joint. It's more than all of government. It includes partners. It is quite literally sort of the idea that we can take any asset to gain an effect in any domain, as long as it gets us towards our objective. It's an emerging concept. It's sort of transitioned from multi-domain to joint all domain. The nomenclature has changed, at least to me. Nothing has changed in terms of what it all means. So just sort of real quick, so I'll open up to questions here in a minute. The world, of course, has changed as more technology comes along. You start out with land warfare being the primary and only domain people are working in. As soon as somebody hit somebody else with a rock and started organizing a fight, you got the land domain, right? Access to the sea comes along with technology for boats and sailing vessels. Then you have access to the air with Kitty Hawk. We're flying airplanes, and pretty soon it's put into military action. The EMS is a little harder to pin down exactly when that starts. I mean, telegraph was a thing back in the 19th century, but electronic warfare really starts picking up World War II, and then certainly not long after that, where we're jamming and doing a lot of action in electromagnetic spectrum. Cyber is a part of that, obviously developing. Space, something we have access to, but when Sputnik's launched in '57, it becomes a space race, and the militarization of space follows shortly thereafter, if not simultaneously. And our structure has changed over time. So one example we show here, like we got here on the slide, is that the joint forces fought differently over time. Wouldn't even call it joint, prior to Goldwater Nichols. But over time, we've become more and more integrated. And so when you get to this idea of multi-domain, then you're bringing in not only the joint force, but you're bringing in all the other instruments of power through interagency with a whole government approach, along with multinational. A lot of you have probably worked with partners from around the world. Just because they aren't wearing our flag, if they're a partner, we are undoubtedly leveraging their capabilities to achieve the effects we need against our adversary. It's multi-domain or joint all domain. It's not a revolution in how we fight necessarily, but it is an evolution. It's a transition in terms of how we employ force over time. Real quick, this is the definition that we and JADS use to define a domain. There are efforts at the moment to define it. It's still pretty squishy. To me, it all starts with this idea of what a domain actually is. If you're going to start talking this. We call it a critical macro maneuver space whose access or control is vital to the freedom of action and superiority required by the mission. And this helps us, once you get a definition of the domain, then you can start sorting out what is and what isn't. We see 6: EMS, space, air, land, maritime, and human domain. You guys are probably pretty familiar. Without the EMS, without access to the EMS, we can't really do much of anything in terms of the way we fight now. It'd be very difficult not to work without comms, to work without any sort of cyber interaction or anything like that. So oftentimes EMS is kind of the high ground there. If you can dominate the EMS, which would be a tall order, but if you could, you more or less control everything. Then you have space enabling air, land, and maritime, your GPS and comms and things like that. All of this influences the human domain. And JADO, it recognizes these temporally limited, so these time-based opportunities, and deliberately exploits the domain interdependencies, because all of these domains depend on one another. It's very rare to find something that only uses one domain. And most of our technology and the way we fight leverages quite a bit more than that. But exploiting those interdependencies through access or control of key segments of the domain within the continuums. This provides us opportunities. If you probably heard from Goldfein's speech, 1 if by sea, 2 if by land, or however that works exactly, but 3 if by air and 4 if by EMS, and just presenting complicated sight picture to the adversary. Here's a very simple graphic of what that might look like. So you see the domains laid out there. A directed energy weapon, EMS, hitting space, jacks up the PNT across the 3 traditional domains. It causes problems for these missions: close air support, aerial interdiction, surface action groups, missile defense. And then vice versa, this falls apart. Oops, sorry, back it up. And so you see how one action can disrupt and influence all the other domains. And so on the far right, though, to point this out real quick, You have the human domain, which is probably the most difficult to define and discuss how it works. And this is where information operations are happening primarily. But we define the human domain as leaders, organizations, populations. This is ultimately what all warfare is driving towards. We're trying to get somebody to behave differently. So we're trying to get Saddam to leave Kuwait. We're trying to get Milosevic to stop killing Kosovars in the Balkans. We're trying to get China to quit operations in the South China Sea, things like that. We're trying to make somebody change their behavior. So, blowing things up and things like that, they serve a purpose, but ultimately is to make a person change their behavior, to do something different, change the decision. So that's why the human domain is often, I think, useful at the very end of this tale, because all the actions happening in the other domains are meant to change somebody's behavior. So the question I'm going to wrap this up with, has warfare changed? Probably. And then we have here, this is just a little over a year ago, 2 years ago, Saudi, the Iranian attack on Saudi oil facilities. Was that an act of war? He says it was, but we didn't go to war with Iran. So what does that mean? Well, it means it must be in this gray zone competition space. And the last thing I want to say to you guys is, if you're sitting here going, well, how the heck do we, as Air Force officers, wrap our heads around this and consider all of the complexity and challenges of a globally integrated operation or a gray zone operation that requires us to do things a bit differently than we normally do? Yeah, that's a big challenge. That's a challenge from the political leadership to determine what they want to do when presented with a gray zone action, what instrument of power or how they want to integrate instruments of power. Are they just going to say it's actual war? I mean, hell, this is Secretary of State saying it's an act of war, but we didn't actually go to war. All the way down to Air Force leadership. How do they develop and employ the force they have? And how do they plan and budget for a force that may not be in a normal conflict, where you might not need, air superiority in the traditional sense? You might need your 5th gen to do something else to support information operations or something. Down to the wing and the squadron level of how do you employ and prepare your airmen for actions in the gray zone? How do you do mission command if we're going to be in a fight that requires us to be cognizant of the fact that the EMS and our environment is going to be extremely contested, and they're going to go after our superiority typically in the EMS and with asymmetric action. And next thing we know, we don't have comms. How do we prepare our airmen to fight and to lead in those environments? How do you communicate to your airmen that this boring action where we're just transiting a strait or overflying a country or we're helping another country with their own foreign internal defense, how do we explain that as a very strategically important action that is tied to broadly the national interests of the United States? It's super challenging, and that's the kind of stuff that requires leaders at all levels to have a pretty good understanding of what our national interests are, what are the policy directives that we receive from the president and from the White House in general. How is that translated through our guidance documents, the NSS, the NDS, NMS, so that when we're actually employing our airmen and our capabilities in support of these gray zone actions, we fully understand that. I am going to wrap it up so I can leave some time for questions. Let me see here, try to get off the share screen so I can see people. And then over to you guys. Chris, I think the screen's still up.
Yes, sir. This was a late discovery, but I was driving the slides kind of behind the scenes. So let me try to unshare this. If anybody that has logged in has any questions for Dr. Donnelly, please type it in the conversation chat, please.
Example of things to do at your level. So before squadron command, you're probably, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't know that you'll necessarily be the person making a decision on how to employ folks. But something you can absolutely do as leaders within your squadron is help communicate sort of why we might be acting at in sort of in a gray space. Understanding the NMS, the NDS can really help you sort of provide context for your airmen of our national interest in a region. It's I know, for example, with bomber task force stuff, being stationed in Guam and just flying circles, heading out along 8-hour sortie and flying back, and it can seem really boring, and I'm certain it is because you're not doing much other than flying. But connecting that to the big picture of this is why we're flying against Russia. To help communicate a strategic message. That's the type of stuff that I think is really, really useful. And frankly, the leadership needs people down in the squadron explaining things like that. It's difficult, I think, for airmen, young airmen, for example, to find themselves in a situation where they're not doing something cool, blowing something up in Syria or Afghanistan, to recognize how a non-kinetic sort of seemingly boring action or useless action is actually tied to a much, much bigger picture when it gets into strategy. Taylor's question here. What kind of act or where do you believe the U.S. would draw the line between gray zone warfare and conventional warfare? Yeah, that's great. As I mentioned early in the lecture, that's a moving target. There I guess basically has to be a point where the U.S. believes that their national interests are threatened to an extent that you want to invest lives and treasure. We've got the last 20 years to look at. Why were we in Iraq? So we were, for a couple of reasons, at least as described by the Bush administration, one of which being to overthrow a dictator and make the world safe for democracy, essentially. I don't think that would be a reason anymore. I think we've got our fill of helping people to be democracies and learning that maybe not everybody wants or can be a democracy. So I don't think that would quite do it. I struggle to see open warfare in the conventional sense with China. I think it's really difficult to think of a situation where our national interest would really put us in a place where we would, for example, put 2 carriers at the bottom of the ocean, because the fight with China would be pretty tough. Russia, I can see a little bit more. I think they're going to test Article 5, particularly when it comes to cyber, a lot more in probably somewhere in the Baltics would be my guess. I could see something happening there. You can already see with the shift between the Trump and the Biden administration in terms of how we communicate our resolve with NATO, that we're sort of back in the game, I guess, with NATO in terms of drawing a hard line there for Russia. Frankly, though, I think broadly our leadership is really hesitant to go into an open conflict, and I don't blame them. This is a tough decision. That's why I think this gray space is something we need to be a lot more comfortable with than we are now, because if we're going to be reluctant to go to open warfare, then the only thing left for us to compete against our adversaries is in the gray space. Yeah, so podcast or TV series. So I'm not a big podcaster, but I can definitely recommend some articles, Bridget. I'll get some to hate some articles on Great Power Competition. There's a lot of really good reading out right now from CSIS and from RAND and things like that, talking about Great Power Competition. One TV series, Madam Secretary, actually I think is pretty good, talking about Great Power Competition. She spends a lot of time in that show, the character playing Secretary of State, getting sort of unconventional ways to compete with China and Russia and other powers at the time. So yeah, Madam Secretary might be a good TV show to get an idea of the complexity of gray zone warfare. Aaron Wing, dialogue. Yep, that's a tough one. How, the school bully analogy. Yeah. I think at times with China, it might be useful for us to be the kid that stands up to the bully and punches him in the nose real quick, and that's it. Oftentimes, particularly in gray zone, our adversaries are continuing to push a line, and to see where our boundary is. Are they really going to do something? Are they really going to react if we, build an island here? Are they really going to react if we seize a port here? Where are they going to do something? And they'll continue on that path, continue to push us until they get that a reaction that they don't want. Again, I mentioned earlier, one of the reasons why our adversaries are so much in the gray zones because they don't want to compete with us head to head. And not that we want open warfare, so this would be a pretty difficult thing to do. But if you did sort of punch the bully in the nose to present the point that you're not going to be pushed around anymore, that they had crossed the red line, you probably by that point you would be establishing that line, and they'll have to back off of it. You saw that a bit with Iran. So after our strike with Soleimani, they hit Al-Assad and things like that, but they were pretty dang quiet considering how aggressive they'd been. I think we demonstrated with the Soleimani strike that where that red line was, or how far we were willing to go, and that was sort of one of the bloody in the nose, if you will. And I think that they sort of backed down a bit from that. Now, making sure we don't react and go over the line into open conflict, that's tough. It's a little easier with Iran because they aren't a great power. They're a big power. They're a regional power for sure, but they're not China and not Russia. So it'd be a little trickier higher on. But I think to some degree, I mean, you kind of have to. You may have to. I'm not advocating necessarily, but you may have to take a kinetic action to keep things in a space that you're willing to deal with it. That's a tough question. A good one. Balance combat the risk. Balance/combat the risk aversion inherent civilian leaders. Yep. Yeah, this is hard. Our competition, their leaders are not nearly as averse to risk because their risks are just dramatically different. I think one of the big things is communicating risk. Properly communicating risk allows people to make better judgment on what they should or shouldn't do. And not only risk of, hey, if we do this, this is what we risk, but you also need to explain the risk they assume by not taking that action. If you don't do this, we risk China being more aggressive in this area, or we risk losing a partner in Africa, or we risk losing the credibility of Article 5 if we don't do something here. That's a tough deal, though. Risk aversion is pretty real, although sometimes it's not real enough. You get situations where they don't want to commit a lot of resources, but they're willing to put some lives on the line. And so you question, right? If it was worth the lives of these operators, is it not worth us taking a bigger stand here? That's a tough one. But yes, communicating risk both for what happened, the risk you assume if you make the decision, but also the risk they assume if they don't make a decision, if they don't take an action. And right now, I feel like our leadership isn't, our civilian leadership at least, is not as familiar with the risk they're assuming by not acting in these spaces or against those actions. Do you believe China and Russia's ultimate goal is to see the end of the United States as we now know it, or as we know it? Yeah, I would say the latter. I think they're simply gaining more power through competition. This is one of those things where Iran might want death to America, and that actually is probably more propaganda than anything else. But I don't think China and Russia do. I think they simply want to be the top dog. They want to be able to call in the shots. They, the revisionist power, they want to rewrite the world to put them in a better situation. As you guys probably know, China has a closing window of time where they're going to have the resources, the population, and all that to change their position in the globe. Russia's window's already passed. Russia can make a lot of noise, but frankly, I think Crimea is as far as they're going to go. It could be proven wrong. If you think you've got the world figured out, then you're probably wrong. I would definitely acknowledge that I do not have it all figured out. But my gut is that no, they don't want to destroy the U.S. as they know it now. They simply want to change the power relationship between the two, in the sense that they want to better their position where they call more shots and we call less shots. So, yeah, Chris, Captain Campbell's question was the last one. That's right. Anything else you guys need, let me know. Shoot me an email. I'm one building over at ACSC. Appreciate the opportunity to chat with you guys, and look forward to any further questions. And I'll try to get some reading recommendations to you guys through your faculty.
All right, Dr. Donnelly, on behalf of SOS 21 Echo, we thank you for sharing your knowledge and expertise. Thank you so much. This now concludes this guest speaker event. We'll now ask the students to depart for the rest of the day. Guys. Thank you so much.